In this section, we're going to talk about the abstractness of URs, of underlying representations, and what that particular term means in phonology, abstract, is basically a case where the surface forms look very different from their hypothesized underlying representations, which again, we never get to look at the underlying representation of a word in the lexicon. You can't reach out and touch it. You can't see it. You can't hear it in the world. It's inferred from surface data. So to the extent that sometimes the underlying representations we infer look pretty different from the things we see on the surface, we refer to them as being abstract. Right? And so we've already seen one case of like semi-abstractness. There's a continuum here from very concrete underlying representations to extremely abstract ones, and we're going to take a little bit of a journey along this continuum in this section. So let's think back to the German problem we looked at with alternations last week, and actually briefly the week before. What we saw in German is that there are certain alternating words. One of them was the word for murder, Mord, where in isolation you get an underlying, in isolation you get a voiceless stop at the end of them. But if you put an affix on them, in this case the plural schwa, they instead surface as voiced. And we saw reasons to believe in German that the underlying representations here must actually have the voiced stops in them, but that at the end of a word, all stops predictably neutralize to voiceless. So this was another case of positional neutralization. In order to get positional neutralization in OT, what's our ranking formula? Ranking formula is context-specific markedness, dominating faithfulness. That gives you the positional neutralization part. But faithfulness dominating general markedness, that gives you the contrast elsewhere part of the pattern. And so in this case, we saw some evidence from other languages that the general markedness or context-free markedness constraint relevant to voicing in obstruents was this one, that bans voiced obstruents. So there are languages like Maori which only have voiceless obstruents, so we need a general constraint like this. Relevant faithfulness here is going to be the feature voice, because that's what we're going to be looking at. So ident voice is in the middle. And then the context-specific markedness constraint here is don't have a voiced obstruent at the end of a word, because this has two locations specified in it. It bans some feature or combination of features in some specific context. That makes it context-specific. So how is this going to work? Well, the basic idea here is that if you're not at the end of a word, this constraint has absolutely nothing to say. That's the case when you have a following vowel here. There are no word final obstruents in any of these candidates. Therefore, this constraint is irrelevant. The next highest goal in this grammar is preserving the value of the voice feature that was found in the lexicon in the underlying representation. So that's going to favor faithful mapping of both voiced and voiceless obstruents. This item happens to have a voiced one. If it were another word, it might have a voiceless one. They both surface faithfully, and they'd be able to contrast here. So again, faithfulness to voicing, plus voice, we're all set. Plus voice, minus voice. Eliminate that. So we get the voiced alternate surfacing here. General markedness, don't have a voiced obstruent. Our faithful form violates that constraint, but it doesn't matter because in this language, in general, elsewhere, voicing contrasts are preserved because preserving your voicing feature is a more important goal than avoiding voice stops in general. However, voice stops at the end of a word are particularly bad, and so here, in the simple form, we do run into this context, and now this context-specific markedness constraint becomes relevant. So in particular, does one of these end in a voiced obstruent? Why, yes, this one does. Therefore, eliminate it. So in the simple form here, we're going to get a voiceless stop, but in the complex form, we'll get the voiced stop. In terms of changing voicing, this is plus voice in the lexicon. It's the same underlying representation in both of these words. So plus voice, we're all set. Plus voice, minus voice, no good. And then in general, having a voiced obstruent, this one does, this one doesn't. But here, the context-specific markedness constraint takes over and neutralizes the contrast between voiced and voiceless obstruents in German. What's interesting about this is that it's somewhat abstract in the following sense. You might want to think that if you're trying to figure out the underlying representation of a morpheme in some language, the easiest way to do that would be to just look at how the morpheme is pronounced in isolation. This German case shows that that's not how phonology works. Right? Now, sometimes the isolation form of a morpheme will also be its underlying representation, but in other cases, you need to look at how that morpheme behaves in more complex morphological contexts in order to see what the real underlying representation is. Right? If you put the underlying representation Wort, which I think means word in German, in this exact same tableau, you would find that it would also surface with a final voiceless stop, and you might assume that the ends of those two lexical entries are exactly the same, but you'd be wrong. They're actually quite different, the underlying representations. This one has a voiced consonant at the end. Wort has a voiceless one. You can't see that difference until you get them in a different phonological context, namely in this case, before a vowel. Here it becomes apparent that Maud actually has an underlying voiced obstruent. That's why it surfaces as voiced here. If you put Wort plus a in this same tableau, that would surface faithfully as voiceless, and you'd find the contrast. But you can't just look at the simple form in order to get the underlying representation. Instead, it looks like the underlying representation only appears in more morphologically complex contexts. So that's a somewhat abstract analysis because the underlying representation here is rather different than what you observe on the surface, at least in the morphologically simple case. There can be even more abstract cases than this. There can be cases where you have pretty radical feature changes or whole sequences of segments that are in the underlying representation but don't appear in the citation form. So this particular change of like voice to voiceless is not such a phonetically radical change. These are pretty similar sounds. Sometimes you can get other features changing that are more perceptible. And then the most abstract cases are going to be those where the underlying representation is never actually surfacing in exactly the form we think it's stored in the lexicon. That's going to be the final example for this week. It's a case of total abstraction, where you don't ever actually get to hear all of the sounds in the underlying representation together in one form. So let's go through a sequence of increasingly abstract ones. And the first one here is not going to be too terribly abstract. It's going to be just a sort of different version of a lot of the alternations that we've been looking at so far in this class, but using a different feature. And this comes from Korean. So I guess I'll break down each of these alternation problems into a separate short video. And you can try to solve each one yourself and then watch the video to see if you got it right or not. So let me do that.